Let's get started. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to Who's Reading Who, a webinar on interpretive authority and ethics, co-sponsored by the Virginia Tech Department of Religion and Culture and the Brain Collective. I want to thank our sponsors and our panelists both last week and this week. They have worked so hard in hectic times to share their expertise with us, and so I'm really grateful. I especially want to thank Lynn Huber for making all of our branding and M. Tong for moderating last week's chat and live tweeting the whole webinar. Blake Smith and Cynthia Peacher have been working behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly, so I want to thank them as well. I am really eager to introduce today's panelists, but first, Ava Mroczek is here to talk about the book giveaway and some programming at the Brain Collective.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to hear everybody. I'm going to take 30 seconds. If you're a graduate student, an adjunct instructor, an independent scholar, or you identify in some way with that category, you're eligible to win 200 pounds in Bloomsbury book credits. And I've put in the link into the chat. If you've already entered your name when you were at the last event, you can enter your name again to double your chances to win 200 pounds of Bloomsbury books. So please put in your information, your name and your email. And about halfway through the event, I'm going to collect everything, put it through a randomizer, and Shaylee will announce the winner before the final speaker. And I will be in touch with that person to figure out how to get you your free books. Brain Collective is very excited to co-host and co-sponsor this amazingly collective series of panels. And if you have an idea for a panel that we can help support and help advertise, we have some resources to do that. And we have a few different series that are coming up. We've got our primary text lab coordinated by one of our members, Julia Lindenlaub. The first one's coming up in March. If you have a primary text that you'd like to nerd out with some people live on Zoom, please do that. There is a new PhD showcase series. The next one is going to be about themes of beheading in early Christian literature with Nate Shedd, and that's coming up in February. We'll announce it in a little bit. But if you have a recent PhD, or if you are a recent PhD and want to get some engagement for your work, if you're graduating into this hellscape of a universe this year, that is another option for us. We've had really great attendance at new PhD showcases. So if you are interested in putting together an event with the Brain Collective that we can help, we've got a toolkit up on our website, and I've put that link into the chat as well. But for now, enter your name into the book draw, and I will announce the winner in chat, and Shaylee will announce it before the end of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava. So our team designed today's panel as a response to the question that we posed for ourselves last week. That is, if modes of meaning making emerge, if modes of meaning making that emerge from historical criticisms serve imperialist and nationalist ends and advance the interests of white Christian supremacy, then how might we engage in meaning making in more equitable ways? Today's speakers explore a range of possible answers from multiple contexts, but always from within interpretive communities. I do want to stop here for a second and offer a quick content warning. Some of our speakers will be discussing issues of gender and sexual violence and exploitation, so I want you to consider the following intros and take care of yourselves. Okay, M. Adriel Tong will lead us off with a talk called It's Not in Heaven, Jewish Midrash and the Changeable Original. M teaches New Testament and Judaic Studies at an HBCU, that is an historically Black college or university seminary in Atlanta. She points out importantly that she is one of 2 HBCU affiliates on this panel. Lauren Osborne will present Sound Authority, Orality, Embodiment, and Gender in Reciting the Quran. She's interested in the diverse ways people interact with the Quran, particularly through its sounds. Currently, Lauren is working on a monograph on Quran recitation and how sonic, affective, and emotional and textual meanings interact, correspond, and even come into conflict with one another. In her broader research, as well as in her teaching, Lauren enjoys exploring how religion is felt via the senses and the emotions. Charlotte Eubanks teaches comparative literature, Japanese and Asian studies. They study transnational Buddhism, word image relations, and the material culture of books, focusing on Japanese literature from the Middle Ages to the modern day. Charlotte works as an associate editor for Verge, Studies in Global Asias, and somehow also serves as a department head in these hectic times. They're giving a talk entitled Breathing Reading, What Medieval Japanese Musical Treatises Tell Us About Embodied Ways of Knowing Buddhist Sutras. Erica S. Dunbar teaches students how to critically read and engage the Bible, prioritize collectivism over individualism, and consider communities of accountability when reading. Her work is a dialogical cultural study that examines ancient communities' struggle with sexual violence and exploitation in the Book of Esther, while also sensitizing modern audiences to the issue of global sex trafficking and its implications for Africana women's lives. Her talk today brings all of these interests to bear on the question of interpretive ethics. Lynn Huber will close out our panel as is befitting for an expert in apocalypses. Her presentation is called Not Queer as in Happy, Queer as in Fuck You, The Ethics of Queer Biblical Interpretation. She teaches New Testament and early Christianity in North Carolina and oversees the University Honors Program. She works broadly on queer biblical interpretation and also the Book of Revelation, especially its use of gendered metaphor. She also loves dogs, as does everybody. To our audience, I want you guys to drop any questions into the Q&A. I will pose those to our speakers after everyone's done presenting. I do want to say that we have alt text in PowerPoint slides. For those of our presenters who are using PowerPoint, I'm going to be dropping a link into the chat that has their PowerPoint slides. And so you can bring that up and check out the alt text and follow along. If you have any other questions, just drop them into the chat. All right, that's enough from me. Em, if you would get us started.
Okay. How are we looking? Can y'all see? Okay. So first of all, I want to say we also love cats because I saw several participants that are part of the academic cat mafioso. And then I also wanted to say that it's so funny when I hear Ava talking about 200 pounds of books. I was like, oh, that's very heavy. And then I realized she meant pound sterling. I feel like 200 pounds of books might actually not be that much money. So first off, I want to say Shabbat Shalom for anyone who is observing today. One of the reasons why I requested that I go first is in case you do have to run to light candles, you can. That said, I also want to sort of apologize to any of the if you have heard all of this before, this is going to be very Hebrew schooly. So, but I did want to bring up as a sort of bridge from the last group, really getting at the heart of the question about originalism as an idea itself. And one of the things that I am going to be proposing throughout this talk, which is really just going to be a tour of two very, very famous rabbinic stories, is the idea that the distinction between originalism and what we might call interpretation or reader response doesn't necessarily need to be in conflict. For those of you who are familiar with my work in general, you know that I really dislike the idea of like sort of like differences that are fully distinct. So what I'm going to be trying to do is trouble essentially the distinction and the difference between reader response and originalism. But in case some of this is new, I did want to give a little bit of a background. For those of you who have grown up in a Christian culture, which the United States would count as one, you are probably familiar with this idea that Judaism is legalistic. This can often be expressed in specific texts in the New Testament, which, if read within the history of Christian biblical interpretation, make it sound as though Jesus is opposed to a Judaism that is legalistic. And so here's an example from Luke 6:6-11, very famous story of the man with the withered hand. On another Sabbath, he, meaning Jesus, entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to him, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at all of them, he said, "Stretch out your hand." He did so. His hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So this is a passage within the New Testament that is often used to support a stereotype of Judaism as legalistic. For specifically, there seems to be an implication in this passage that it's not lawful to heal on the Sabbath, which is actually not true. But beyond this, the fact of its actual inaccuracy, it still remains sort of central to a lot of Christian opinions about Judaism. So I have here several tweets that I just picked very quickly off of Twitter that are a pretty good sampling of sort of typical like stereotype, like typical anti-Jewish stereotypes. So here, James Martin, Father Martin, is trying to sort of equivocate and say that, like, okay, maybe not all Jews are legalistic, but there were definitely Pharisees that were. And then this other person who's arguing that Judaism is bondage to sin, which is, just really great. And so there's this concept in like Christian majoritarian cultures that Judaism has a very like literal originalist obsession with the text. As a student of mine once incorrectly said, Jews believe that every single word of the Old Testament, or Jews take every single word of the Old Testament literally. This is what the student said, and I had to stop the class and be like, actually. But when we push back against the idea of Judaism as being legalistic, one of the things that I also want to show is not only is there actually a very rich history of legalism within Christianity, Judaism has a way of reading that I think could really shed light on this distinction between originalism and interpretation. And so I have two stories for you. They are two of the most famous ones. So this is a transporting back to Hebrew school. This one is from Bavli Menachot, so the Babylonian Talmud. It's in a tractate on meal offerings. And this is what it says. It says Rav Yehuda, who is he's a rabbi from Babylon. And he says that Rav is a very famous Babylonian rabbi. When Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born in several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every seraph of these crowns mounds upon mounds of laws. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. And when they say crowns, what is referring to is this. This is Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and these little spikes on top of the Gimel, which if you're not familiar with Hebrew, is the bottom right hand letter. These crowns are not sort of literally part of the typography, but they're decorational additions. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, return behind you, or turn around. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned, and he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, my teacher, from where do you derive this? Rabbi Akiva said to him, it is the law transmitted to Moses from Sinai. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive. Moses returned and came before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said before him, Master of the universe, you have a man as great as this, and yet you still choose to give the Torah through me? Why? God said to him, be silent. This is my intention. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, you have shown me Rabbi Akiva's Torah. Now show me his reward. God said to him, return to where you were before. So turn around. Moses went back and saw they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop, as Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death by the Romans. Moses said before him, Master of the universe, this is Torah, and this is his reward. God said to him, be silent, this is my intention. So the idea behind this story is that from Moses's point of view, God is putting these decorations on these letters, and from Moses's point of view, there's no reason for them. It doesn't actually tell you anything. It doesn't change the text's meaning. But what God is basically saying is that these seeming decorations, things that you don't think produce meaning, will actually be the exact things that will generate meaning in the future. And one of the things that I find so profound and sort of shocking about the story is the ending, which is where Moses is so impressed by Rabbi Akiva's teaching. He says, well, why would you give the Torah to me when there's this guy in several generations, Rabbi Akiva, who's going to be this great interpreter of your Torah? And God says, well, I just decided it. And Moses is like, well, this man, Rabbi Akiva, has such Torah. He's such a wonderful teacher. What was his reward? Because Moses thinks clearly such a great man, God will have showered, gifts upon. And the ending is that actually the scene of Akiva's martyrdom. The second story that I want to give to you or offer to you is a very famous story commonly known as the Oven of Achnai from Bava Metzia in the Babylonian Talmud, which is part of a section of the Talmud that is on tort law. And this is what it says. We learn in a Mishnah, and a Mishnah is the oral Torah. Oh, this is kind of complicated, but it's essentially the oral Torah about which the Talmud is commentating. If one cut an earthenware oven widthwise into segments and placed sand between each and every segment, Rabbi Eliezer deems it ritually pure. Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel, and therefore it is not susceptible to ritual impurity, and the rabbis deem it ritually impure, as it is functionally a complete oven. So the Talmud is bringing up a disagreement which is called a machloket, and it's bringing up a disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbinic majority. These disagreements between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbinic majority is actually kind of like a trope throughout the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer always seems to be like kind of the odd guy out. And here they're disagreeing upon whether a certain kind of oven is or is not susceptible to ritual impurity. And this is what happens. This is known as the oven of Achnai. And the Gemara asks, what is the relevance of Achnai? So that means a snake in this context. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, it is characterized in that manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like the snake, which often forms a coil when it rests, and deemed it impure. So they gathered around it and made a decision. The sages taught, on that day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. So the carob tree got up out of the ground and walked around. The rabbi said to him, Rabbi Eliezer, okay, you made a carob tree walk around, but you don't prove the correctness of your legal interpretation because of a carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backwards and began flowing in the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not prove the correctness of one's legal interpretation from a stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are debating legal matters with each other, what is the nature of your involvement, meaning the walls? Like, why are you getting involved in a debate between legal scholars? And so the Gemara has a side that says the walls did not fall because of deference to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they also didn't stand back up because of deference to Rabbi Eliezer. And so they're all on a slant even to today. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the law is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? And Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven, which is a quote from Deuteronomy 30:12. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of this phrase, it is not in heaven, in this context? Rabbi Jeremiah said, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah. After a majority, you should incline. So you should go with majority opinion. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the law is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. The Gemara relates, years after, Rabbi Natan encountered Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, and said to him, what did the Holy One, what did God do at the time when Rabbi Yehoshua said it is not in heaven? And Eliyahu says, God, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have bested me, my children have bested me. So one of the things that I find so amazing about these two stories is that they both come together to express that the original intention of the Torah was in order for humans to interpret it. And so in this way breaks down this distinction between what is the meaning of the original text, or how should the original text be interpreted? And, meaning is only generated at the point of the reader. This is saying that actually from the beginning, from God's own, voice on Mount Sinai, that the entire intention of this teaching was so that we could then take it and interpret it. So that's where I'm going to wrap up. I welcome any questions or thoughts, or if you want to just engage in the material. I'm really excited for that, and I'm excited to hear the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Em. So next up is Lauren Osborne, and I will be dropping Lauren's slides into the chat as well.
Hi there, thank you. So I'm going to be kind of switching off between like me and slides, and I have a short video clip for you. My slides they're only a couple slides. I'm not a big slides person, so I'll be sort of moving back and forth. But first I want to say like huge thanks to Shaylee for organizing us, for bringing us together in such an isolated time. And I'm in a particularly isolated place in an isolated time. It's just really nice to be able to get to like talk with other people about these things. And then big thanks to also all the other panelists on both panels, Virginia Tech, the Brain Collective, everybody. Super psyched to be here. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen here. Is it okay if I tweet links to slides? Oh, yeah, that's fine with me. I'm not sure about, I'll let other people respond for themselves, but CJ to respond to you right now for me, yeah. So let me go to my slides here. So can folks see this? So I'm going to be speaking primarily about non-discursive meaning in reading and interactions with the Quran. And I'm doing this by way of introducing a specific example and using it as a way to briefly introduce some of the main things that a non-specialist needs to know about Quran recitation, and also to open up broader points in relation to the rest of these everyone's presentations on these panels. So a great deal of what I have to say and what I focus on in my work is about the interactions between discursive and non-discursive realms of meaning in relation to the recited Quran. So I do a lot with text and sounds of texts, but then also emotions and affect and senses and those kinds of things like Shaylee mentioned earlier. So while I'm focusing on recitation and I'm really leaning into the non-discursive side of this today, there's of course a very rich, I just want to say, rich and prominent exegetical tradition in Islam in relation to the Quran as well, right? So it's not the case that the Quran is only engaged with non-discursively. So I'm going to switch over to this video quickly for you here. In order to begin, I'm going to be showing you just about a minute of this YouTube video of Quran recitation. I've written about this recently, so inshallah, you can hopefully read something about this in 2022, although we all know academic publishing speeds. I wish I could play the whole video for you because it's a beautiful recitation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link for you in the chat so you can open it up in a tab and listen to it later if you want to, especially if you haven't really heard the recited Quran a whole lot before or have never heard it. I would encourage you to do so. It's beautiful. It's a really, this particular recitation is it's one I find to be very, very moving and very interesting and fruitful. So this video is of Chaplain Tahira Ahmed. She is the Associate Chaplain and Director of Interfaith Engagement at Northwestern University. So she's known as a chaplain, as a sort of interfaith activist, both in the Chicago area and then nationally as well, and then also as a Quran reciter. And this is a video of her reciting to open the main session of the 2013 annual convention of the Islamic Society of North America, which I'll refer to as ISNA. And you can see here from the title of this video down here, she's the first woman to recite in order to open this convention or to recite at this convention. Just to describe the video a little bit, because of what it is, recitation, there's not captions available. The visuals consist of a veiled Muslim woman standing at a stage in a conference setting, a very conference-y looking room, as you'll see when the video pans around with a podium in front of her. She's flanked by 2 American flags. She's facing an audience of several hundred people, which I think is only shown later in the video than we'll get to. And she's reciting the Quran in Arabic. I'll mention the contents of the passage that she's reciting in my presentation, but of course my point here is that the meanings of the words are both important, but not also the total extent of what we might have to say about this. Because of what it is, a recitation, like I said, the video doesn't have captions. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم Okay, so I'm unfortunately going to pause it there, so I have time for the rest of my presentation. But I encourage you to listen to the rest of it later if you have a moment. It's gorgeous. What she got through there was basically just introducing the recitation, saying hello to the audience, and then reciting just about one verse. Yes, the woman sitting in front of her is signing in ASL before the audience, and she's not shown throughout the video. Unfortunately, it would greatly increase the accessibility of the video if it were. But someone, I think it was recorded on a phone, sort of panning around the room, but you can see the interpreter in later points in the video. She's referring to her phone, which, like, I'm guessing has a Quran app on it where you can see the text, and she's signing the meanings of the text in ASL, I would guess, given the context that she's reading an English translation and then interpreting it and presenting it in ASL for the audience, as Ahmed is reciting in Arabic. So it's a really like multilinguistic situation happening there. So my point here is that Quran recitation is both tied to its specific place and history within Islamic tradition, but also the particularities of the context and the occasion in which it occurs. And this is something that I understand as being really wide ranging, right? There's a lot that we could discuss in order to understand this as fully as possible. In order to consider the account of this recitation, Ahmed's 2013 ISNA recitation most fully, we must account for not only the role of recitation and its rules and background in Islamic tradition, but also the context of the particular occasion in which it occurs. This 21st century convention of the most major organization representing North American Muslims, as well as the reception and circulation of the recitation on global media. So discourse about it in communities after the fact, as well as how it circulates in this video on YouTube and more broadly. Ahmed's recitation of the Quran at the 2013 ISNA convention is, of course, one iteration of recitation in a long history of practice, understood as originating with and recreating the original moments of the Quran's revelation by God to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. The importance and role of Quran recitation can be understood as beginning with the Quranic text itself and its most immediate context or audience, and also developing and playing a key role in tradition as it extends out in front of the text or beyond that. The centrality of recitation to Islamic practice and to the understanding of the Quran and tradition is often argued through reference to its original understanding of its milieu in the 7th century, which was a highly oral one, oral and oral, and also theological claims about the Quran's revelation and self-understanding. To folks who are unfamiliar, the Quran is a highly self-referential text. It talks about itself, and it does so a lot. So you hear kind of echoes of that sometimes coming up in the way in which I and other Quran scholars talk about it making certain kinds of claims about itself. I think especially to folks who are unfamiliar, this can be a little bit of a surprise. It's a really fascinating feature of the text, I think. In most Islamic theological traditions, most but not all, the Quran is understood as being the words of God, normally understood to be the perfect, complete message from God as originally revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. Recitation is seen then as being essential in terms of the origins and theological status of the work, and plays a key role in transmitting and preserving the text, especially in the early tradition when really the oral spoken language was understood as being permanent and authoritative as opposed to the written, right? And plays a key role as the foundation of Islamic education and ritual practice, both historically and globally. So when we see Chaplain Ahmed reciting here in 2013, that's in Washington, D.C., where she's reciting, that recitation is understood as being continuous with that tradition, beginning with the moments I just spoke about. And in large part, as an extension of the theological understanding of the status of the Quran, it is most properly always recited in Arabic. I say most properly, of course, I'm seeking to articulate the centrality and importance of the specifics of language, but also not invalidate anyone's specific practice that might be different from that as well. There is a system of rules governing the specifics of pronunciation and techniques of recitation called tajweed, and these exist ostensibly in order to maintain clarity of productions of sounds of words so that they are accurately conveyed. For anyone here today familiar with the chanting of the Hebrew Bible, it's quite similar to the way in which that practice is managed, especially with respect to pronunciations. And my sense is that there's specific historical reasons for that, although it's not something I've looked into a great deal myself. So the Quran, as I've mentioned, is almost always recited in Arabic, regardless of the language or languages understood on the part of the reciters or listeners. And this point is in relation to the theological understanding of the Quran, and that's in large part where the role of non-discursive meaning comes in. The recitation is of value, understood as being of value, regardless of the discursive understanding of reciters and listeners, and yet the discursive meaning of the text is always ostensibly of the utmost importance. I say ostensibly because while that is true, especially if there's a very strong theological claim in that regard, there's also a particular tradition of very melodic and emotional recitation styles where the clarity of the discursive context of the text is debatable, and that's especially nowadays that's quite contested in the tradition. So my choice of an example of an American reciter reciting in America is obviously very deliberate here. Sure, there are probably native speakers of Arabic in that audience, and in order to recite this well and serve as a Muslim chaplain, Ahmed is obviously very clearly trained in Arabic, but that is only part of the point here. As I've explored further, many specific aspects of this occasion of recitation, as well as its, are things that we need to think about, as well as its reception. So the discursive contents of what she recites here are both appropriate and important to the specific occasion, but not the complete picture. And now I'm going to go back to show you a slide again. Sorry, just taking away the sound options for you here. So for those who are curious to see the specific text that's being recited here, I have these verses for you here on the page. And if you listen to the rest of the video that I linked, you can hear that she recites in a way that is quite slow and measured and paced. She often has to pause mid-verse in order to breathe, and then also for sort of impact of recitation as well. And so these 6 verses take her about 8.5 minutes to get through in that video. So for curious listeners, her recitation consists of the last 6 verses of the 59th surah of the Quran called Al-Hashr, or the Exile. So for anyone who wants a closer read, I have a translation of those verses up here, and there's a link at the bottom to a web page that is like a really super navigable and accessible and really useful online format for viewing the Quran. The translation I have up here is my favorite one, available on that site by Abdul Halim. You can change between different translations on the settings on the right-hand side of the page if you want to look around. The audience at the ISNA convention could be presumed to consist primarily of North American Muslims. Correspondingly, this passage that Ahmed recites here begins with an address that would seem to speak directly to this audience, you who believe. It's addressing the faithful, right? It's addressing monotheists, the audience of the Quranic text. The passage could be read as addressing the nascent community of Muslims originally receiving and listening to these words in the 7th century, but also to folks in the room listening to Ahmed's 21st century Washington, D.C. recitation, and in that occasion serving as a reminder, as this passage does more broadly if you read on, and a rearticulation of the key messages of the Quranic text and key messages of Islamic faith writ large, right? There's key articulations of monotheism and key aspects of practice, and arguably the role of the prophet and revelation here as well. Really core central values in Islamic tradition. So this passage could be seen as being comprehensive in its brief articulation of the basics of faith, and something that, especially to an audience of North American Muslims, really sets the stage for like the major annual meeting of those communities in North America. So if we are to consider this or any other example of Quran recitation most fully in context, however, we need to think far beyond the boundaries of this text. And now I'm going to take it away from you, which is you can refer to it because Shaylee put the link there, but this is also a little bit deliberate on my part. I don't want the words up in front of you the whole time I'm talking about non-discursive meanings, right? So we need to think beyond the boundaries of the text beyond its meanings and beyond even its sounds, as well as beyond specific moments of the recitation itself. We need to understand the role of recitation in Islamic tradition and history, of course, as I've said, but we also need to think a lot about what's going on in the room here, as well as the reception of this recitation in that room, but also as it circulates in discourse after the fact and as this video circulates online. We need to think about Ahmed, who she is, especially as a figure of religious authority, an American, a woman, a Muslim, and a chaplain. And this is all the things that I would locate in the realm of non-discursive meaning. I have a couple links for you that I'll share at the end that are interviews with Ahmed on WBEZ Chicago, where she spoke about the reception of her recitation and the video it circulated online, as well as a video of her reciting. She was, I believe, the first American woman to recite representing the United States in a recitation competition in Indonesia. So she's speaking about a circulation of a video. She's very accomplished, a video of that online. The discourse and debate about this largely centered around her gender, right? And this is another reason in which my choice of this example is very deliberate for you here, right? So I've centered her as being a religious authority, with which we can explore Quran recitation in general, right? That's a sort of implied argumentative move on my part. But this is also something that was debated a great deal in reaction in tradition, having to do with her gender, the nature of her religious authority, specifically her authority not only as a reciter, but as a chaplain and as a religious leader and an interfaith leader as North America. But as well, there was a great deal of debate about the ethics and appropriateness or etiquette of her as a female reciter before a mixed gender audience as well. And that's something you can hear her speak about in those interviews that I'll share links with you in the chat and then also on my last slide. So we might begin to wrap up here with the non-discursive in relation to the recited Quran by discussing its status and tradition, as I've said, and the role of language therein, or the sounds of the recitation and its practices and ethics and etiquette. We also need to think broadly about an incredibly wide range of factors surrounding the context and occasion of the recitation, including, but not limited to, the specifics of context of audience, historical and cultural moment and context, and the reciter, the person of the reciter, as well as reactions to all of that. So if you'd like to hear Ahmed talking about the reception of this recitation and others, oops, I'm still in presentation mode. I'm going to put 2 links in the chat for you, and then I'll share, you can see quickly on my last slide, links to those as well. Go back to that. These are 2 stories that were on Chicago Public Radio that were interviews with her about the video that I've shared here and about in response to another video of her reciting in Indonesia, in which she says, you know, the debate about these serves as an opportunity as well as a challenge to especially North American Muslims to see if the community is ready to have, basically, she says, a conversation about the intellectual tradition and the possibilities for gender and religious authority therein. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So next up is Charlotte, and again, I will be dropping the links in the chat.
All right, can everybody see what I'm showing and hear what I'm saying? Groovy. Okay, cool. So again, thanks to everybody for being here, for inviting me in, and for letting me be part of this panel on sacred text interpretation and the ethics of those things. As Shaylee said at the start, most of my work is on Buddhism, and particularly on medieval Japanese Buddhism. And I like to think about embodied epistemologies, which is just like ways of meaning making that are rooted in the body and in the senses, and that decenter the meaning of semantic meanings of the words more generally. And I've been working a lot recently on practices involving singing and chanting. And that's what I had actually intended to talk about today. I meant to talk about breathing and what medieval Japanese Buddhist treatises tell us about embodied ways of knowing Buddhist sutras. But then Shaylee provoked us as we were getting ready for these thoughts with a question about QAnon, which I won't pose here. I'm going to let her pose it later, but it's basically like, you know, we want to allow people in local places to make local meanings, like, but ... You can imagine the question. And so I was like, all right, fine. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about translated Buddhism and the pictorial sutras of early modern Japan instead. And I hope that it'll set the stage for some interesting conversations about translation and ethics, as have all the talks so far. So I have organized this talk around 4 things to know. So you can pace me through here. It's going to look like a lot of slides, but it's not. So the first thing to know is that Buddhism has always been translated in Japan. In the earliest centuries of the Common Era, Central Asian monks rendered the Buddhist scriptures into a whole host of languages, including Chinese. When they did that, and I'm just going to focus on Chinese for a minute, they chose to translate some terms and they chose to transliterate other words. So you get a translation of a term like shunya, which is a Sanskrit word that means emptiness or interdependence. The idea that there is nothing that is separable. Everything is in relation, and that is a kind of emptiness. That's often translated into Chinese as kong, which means empty or open or like the sky that's up over our heads. But other words didn't find a parallel in the Chinese language, and so they transliterated them. One example of that is the word paramita, which refers to the ethical perfections of an enlightened being. And that is generally transliterated as these 4 characters, bolamido, which are wave, gauze, honey, and many. Makes no sense, but that enters the Sinitic lexicon as a loan word. And it's one of the great curiosities of much of East Asian Buddhism that even into the 21st century, the sutras thereafter have remained by and large in the language of classical Chinese. So a situation not dissimilar to the position of 8th century Arabic with relation to the Quran. So if we look at the entire Heart Sutra, for instance, this is Xuanzang's 7th century Chinese translation, and you can see that about 1/4 of it is transliterated. All the stuff in red is stuff that's just coming straight out of Sanskrit. So this historical peculiarity raises, I think, a lot of questions about how clerics and especially lay devotees without specialized linguistic knowledge conceived of and accessed the scriptures. And yet we know that reciting the scriptures, memorizing and reciting them was hugely important to Buddhist communities all over South and East Asia and remains hugely important in the larger Buddhist diasporas today. And so I want to focus in today on a group of subsistence farmers in 17th century Japan who put a really high premium on learning to read the sutras. And I kind of go down a D.F. McKinsey hole here where I'm looking at these sutras as social products and not simply as verbal constructs. So the second thing to know is a little bit about the Heart Sutra. It's a really important Buddhist teaching. It's right at the heart of, thus the title, right, of a lot of the teachings. It's concise, it's repetitive, it's easy to memorize. I memorized it while I was mowing the lawn, right? And it's got all these short phrases in it about recognition of suffering. The 2 phrases about recognition of suffering that are particularly compelling are both spoken by the enlightened being Avalokiteshvara, who you see an image of here on the right. And there's a description of this in the alternate text if you're accessing that. Avalokiteshvara, known as Guanyin in the Sinosphere, as Kannon in Japan, is the popular bodhisattva of compassion. She is sometimes female, sometimes male. Gotta rock that, that's pretty awesome. And in the sutra, in the opening lines, he or she attains this deep insight, understanding that all aspects of existence are empty, and this is the uppermost green thing, and thus achieves release from all hardship and suffering. Avalokiteshvara then goes on to explain the nature of this insight and then concludes in the bottom green phrase, by giving all of their listeners a mantra to recite, the repetition of which it is claimed will release and remove all suffering. This is a pretty powerful teaching, right? Memorize this, recite it, all suffering can be released. And I think it was in part because of that message that this sutra became so popular to recite all over the world. The the specific place I want to focus on here for the next few minutes is the Nambu region of what's now northeastern Japan. It's still considered remote and impoverished today. It was super remote and super impoverished in the 1600s. Poor soil, long winters, cold summers, unexpected blizzards, devastating famines, right? It's been the borderland of a borderland for centuries. All right, so that's where we are. Third thing to know is the sutras that show up in this area of Japan are rebuses, right? So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in East Asian Buddhism, like it remains dominated by Chinese, and translations into local vernaculars were exceedingly rare. That's doubly the case in remoter regions like Nambu, which is the borderland of a borderland. So to read the Heart Sutra for folks in this rural area of Japan would have required extensive exposure to Chinese orthography, writing, language, grammar, right? In order to just produce the appropriate sounds. What their local sutra tradition does, though, is to reduce that barrier to access by turning it into pictures. Turns the whole thing into pictures. So there was a Zen monk whose name is Zenpachi in the 1690s. He was accused of embezzlement. Turns out he was innocent, but he went out to live out his period of suspicion way up in the countryside. And while he was lying low, he met a group of villagers who were really interested in learning to recite the sutra. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, and so he helped them co-create this text. And in the text, you can see the title of it here. I've marked it out in red. So this is the title of the sutra, the Great Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Great Sutra of the Ethics of an Enlightened Being. And here the title is rendered as a target, like a shooting practice target, the side of a cup, a demon mask, a pregnant belly, and you can see the little baby inside there, right? A rice paddy, the heartwood of a cedar tree, which will catch fire even when it's wet, and a temple hall. So villagers could decode the pictures and pronounce them aloud in their local dialect, and they'd produce the same sounds that educated clerics would produce, which I think is super cool. So we've got a couple numbers and a couple of letters here, but for the most part, this is all concrete objects. So I've selected some of these things for you. We've got a bunch of hand tools, things like rope and winnowing baskets and whetstones and weaving shuttles, stackable boxes and casks. We got a bunch of objects that are related to subsistence activities more generally, right? Targets and other hunting related items, bamboo leaves and saws, things related to forestry, paddies and sheaves and winnowing baskets related to rice farming, food, so much food, right? Toasted wheat cake, wheat gluten, tea leaves, various containers, and things related to sericulture like mulberries, for instance. We've got a lot of religious items, right? Temple halls, Buddhas and Bodhisattva statues, relics, monks, priests, incense, lottery sticks, that kind of thing. We've got some domestic and wild animals like horses and chickens and rabbits. And my favorite down here at the bottom is a mosquito. We've got a bunch of body parts. So pregnant bellies, rounded stomachs, eyes, open mouths, hands, and breasts. And here I think it's really wonderful that the breasts that are producing milk, what that's translating is the word qi, which is the enlightened wisdom of a fully realized being. Super cool. And then we've got a very small grouping of things that are like non-local objects. So we've got coins, which weren't in use very much there, chess pieces, written letters of correspondence, and that type of thing. And an elephant, no elephants in Japan. So the elephant is definitely non-local right there. So the final thing to know, and I took Shaylee's like 8 minutes seriously, so I'm going fast, but the final thing to know is that the pictorial sutras, I think, do this really cool thing that I think all of the panelists so far have been talking about, and I hope we'll talk about a lot more, and that is they translate, like in the sense of translation of sacred objects from one place to another, right? It's a sort of like radical act of geotemporal translation. So what I think's going on in these things here is that the images in these sutras provide this visual lexicon, I guess, that's tied to local life. And it's all about fecundity. This is food, warmth, and babies. Babies who live, babies whose mothers have enough nutrition to actually produce milk, place where there's enough food to store up the surplus of them. And this is really important, right? This is an area of Japan which into the 20th century still produced at the village level kokeshi, which are these wooden dolls. They would line them up over the doors of houses, and they stood in for children who had died before the age of 8 or children who were stillborn, so that they could be part of the family and they could be mourned as part of family and village rituals, right? So huge death rates for children at this part of Japan. This is a community that had massive food shortages from 1692 to 1703, right as this text is being created. Again, 1747 to 1757. And the descendants of the people who created these sutras died as refugees along the roadsides in the thousands in 1783 to 1786. So if we read this against the backdrop of local history, this visual lexicon has got a huge cultural preoccupation with food and with nourishment and with survivance. And it's got this background also though of death. So we have a coffin there, and of civil disobedience. You see the man in jail. We also have religious activities, right? And I think these religious activities would have provided one of the potential strategies for overcoming very real anxieties about survival. And I think what's really interesting to me about sutras like this one, and this is one example out of about 6 or 7 that survive, is that if you gaze at the visual landscape imagined in and by the text, you not only reinforce the power of magical language, allowing you to envision a world of plenty, you also actually get at the core of what the sutra itself is trying to teach. So when the sutra talks about release from all suffering and hardship in a place where there's no old age and no death and no suffering and no release of suffering, right? That's right where you are here. And so I've circled in green here where that shows up in both versions of the sutra here. And so I think what's happening is that in this community-generated sutra, we've got this interweaving of sacred word with landscape to create a document that you have to read with your body. You fuse local dialect, that's sound, and quotidian farming objects that you touch every day with your hands and wear against your skin. And you use that to approximate or to get at this language, this specialized language of Sinitic Buddhism. And by doing that, you create this alternative space in which, like, the wonder-working powers of sacred sound translate themselves into their lived reality of subsistence agriculture. And I think that is just beautiful. I think it's just beautiful. And I hope it leads to some questions. I'd be happy to talk about transcendent meaning and the law and other things that show up in the sutras. But I'm going to leave it there for now. And I'm just going to say thanks to everybody for listening.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. So next up is Erica S. Dunbar. Erica, you're up.
Thank you. So often when someone asks me about my research, I open by stating that I interpret the opening chapters of the Book of Esther as a story of sex trafficking. And most times people want to debate and attempt to invalidate my scholarship because I don't solely utilize historical critical methodologies to undergird my interpretive claims, right? So I never engage in debates about biblical interpretation. You have to completely miss me with that. I don't engage in debates. I'm conscious of diverse identities, diverse worldviews, diverse interpretations, and value diverse interpretations. Normative and authoritative interpretations have been made by those who've historically claimed dominant status in society and in biblical studies, namely elder white privileged males. However, their traditional views and interpretations are not and should not be the only accepted and valued interpretations. They are merely widely circulated interpretations because of academia's proclivity to uphold white supremacy in religious discourse, text, and in the classroom. One vivid memory I have of this damning practice is a white female colleague asking me, and I quote, "How do you diversify your syllabi? My syllabus is full of old white men. I have no scholars of colors on it," end quote. I answered, You have to choose to denounce white supremacy and expose yourself to diverse scholars. You created that syllabus. It reflects your allegiance to white supremacist ideologies, practice, and interpretations. Choices. We all make choices. But for far too long, people chose to believe, or at least chose to assert, that there is such a thing as objective interpretation. For many, that assertion was made to validate a belief in and uphold white supremacy. I don't subscribe to this colonialist agenda. As a person of African descent, I employ Africana biblical criticism along with womanist, Black feminist, and post-colonial methodologies to place the particularities of Africana life, culture, and history at the center of the interpretive process. So I investigate and describe sex trafficking in both a literary context, which is the Book of Esther, and in cultural and historical context, namely during the transatlantic slave trade. To illustrate that sexual trafficking is an enduring collective issue that disproportionately impacts minority and minoritized groups in both contexts. And I don't name Africana women because if you read the Book of Esther, there is an explicit reference to Ethiopia and India. So there are multiple minoritized groups in the text, and I do want to acknowledge that, but my framing of my work focuses on Africana women, girls and women. And this orientation enables interpreters to evaluate African presence in the Bible, for one, which is often glossed over and ignored, and the impact of varied portrayals of and ideologies promoted about African girls and women on contemporary identity. So the frameworks of these critical methodologies not only provide opportunities to contextualize and to nuance Africana experiences of exile and diaspora more concretely, but they also provide the interpretive space to explore how histories of collectoral diasporization and other traumatic experiences of gender-based violence, namely sex trafficking, contribute to and impact experiences of collective trauma and corporate identity. So in my work, I advocate for interpreters to become attentive to two different frameworks. And the first is polyvocality and the second is intersectionality. So polyvocality is the narrative's multiple and varied voices and perspectives, even the silenced voices in the text, because the African girls that are represented in the text are not vocal. So we have to be attentive to even the silent and silenced voices, right? Polyvocality not only encourages diverse readings and interpretations of the text, but it also problematizes single axis analysis. So single axis gender analysis in the oppression of the girls in the text. And it enables us to see other markers of difference, such as ethnicity and class, as mutually constitutive, and contributing to personal and social oppression, which is the intersectionality framework. Kimberly Crenshaw is the scholar that I'm quoting and citing here. So polyvocality invites reflection on the multiple spaces summoned and controlled in these contexts, as well as the multiple layers of subjugated, suppressed, and silenced identities of individuals and collectives. And I just want to point out that most of the historical scholarship that I have read on Esther tend to focus on or promote individual over collective and pit Vashti against Esther, which one is unethical to do such a thing, but we have to realize when we apply this lens of collective identity and collective trauma, we can then see that Vashti's story is intricately tied to Esther's story. In fact, it is Vashti's resistance to this sexualized gaze, this sexual oppression that results in not only consequences for her, which is, her being deposed, but the consequences of other girls then being, this is my interpretation, trafficked into the king's palace and then, sexually exploited. So you have this instance of this collective of men putting this collective of females in their place, using sex trafficking, sexual abuse. And what's even more problematic is that it's legalized, right? So polyvocality and intersectionality enables us to identify this sex trafficking enterprise, right? And these frameworks also problematize the dominant analysis that failed to identify intersectional oppression that leads to the institution of sex trafficking in both the Book of Esther and during the transatlantic slave trade. So not only am I attentive to polyvocality, but I also embody it in my scholarship by allowing different voices, different perspectives, and different experiences of multiple Africana women to inform and impact my interpretation of those first 2 chapters. So the question is asked, who's reading who? I'm reading Africana women. I'm citing Africana biblical scholars. I'm citing Africana psychologists, ethicists, nurses, anthropologists, sociologists, novelists, political analysts. I'm citing all of these women who can identify with experiences of diaspora, experiences of abuse. And therefore my work is interdisciplinary, right? And it should be, because sex trafficking is an issue that has physical, social, psychological, biological, spiritual implications. So really quickly, I want to point out 2 problematic features of traditional scholarship that I've engaged on Esther. And one is describing the abuse as a beauty pageant. And the second is interpreting violent qualities of and violent qualities within the text as humorous and or comedic. So scholars tend to frame the abuse as a beauty pageant, which I think minimizes or ignores the scope and the scale of exploitation, as well as the role of movement and transportation in the sexual abuse. This framing ignores these elements of capture, displacement, and non-consensual sex, all mechanisms of sexual trafficking that are outlined in Esther 2, verses 1 through 4. So instead of placing beautification under the rubric of abuse, they place abuse under the rubric of beautification. And beautification becomes a tool of the king to sexually exploit the girls trafficked into his palace. So both the process and the abuse are legalized by his officials, because we all know that traffickers don't work alone, right? So he has these officials that he has these officials that work with him to sustain this trafficking system. And my contextualized interpretation helped readers to first identify trafficking in the narrative, and then it draws parallels to contemporary manifestations of trafficking so that the systemic structure can be critiqued and disrupted. And then the second thing that I mentioned was this humor and comedy, right? So although there are some serious and even resistant tones to comedy, I don't find anything laughable about sex trafficking. It's horrific. And actually in my project, in my scholarship, I argue that we read Esther through the lens of horror as opposed to comedy or some of the other genres that have been applied to it. In fact, in my work, I cite Toni Morrison, who recounted growing up encountering Black girls in book. She said, quote, no one ever took them seriously, end quote. So it's time for us to take Africana girls and women's pain seriously. That's a pain. The pain of sex trafficking is etched into our bodies, is etched into our psyches, is etched into our memories and our histories, both individually and collectively. So if ever there was a time to take seriously sexualized abuse against Black and Africana and other women of color, now is the time. And one final word, I situate my scholarship in social justice movement, such as Me Too and Say Her Name. The African girls in the text and many enslaved African girls and women whose name we may never know, but as morally and ethically responsible biblical interpreters, we must bear witness to their plight and their work to resist rape culture and dismantle global systems of sex trafficking. We must commit to reading between the lines, to reading behind the euphemisms in the text, And through the silences and the silencing in biblical texts and in narrated histories of Africana girls and women across time. And in doing so, we'll redeem the stories and the dignity of all of these girls and women that are impacted, that have for too long been silenced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. So we're going to move on to our last speaker, but before we do that, I just found out the winner of the book giveaway is Megan Remington. So Megan, Eva's going to follow up with you. Our last speaker is Lynn Huber. So take it away, Lynn.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much to all the presenters. My mind is blown by everything that I've heard, and I'll try to keep this. I know we're sort of running out of time, so I'll try to do this a little quickly. But first, I need to give you a caveat. Like, everything I'm saying could be bullshit. And it probably is. So just so you know. So I should also start by saying that in the past couple of years, I've embraced, albeit with some resistance, my identity as a Christian and as a Christian biblical scholar. This is a recognition of the cultural context in which I was raised, and admittedly an excuse for bringing queerness into the realm of Christian biblical interpretation. I realize I can do this because of other privileged identities, mainly being a middle-aged white woman. I foreground identity since this is a thing that unites contextual interpretive practices, of which queer biblical interpretation is one. And a key to their ethical grounding is a commitment to, quote, reading from this place, as Fernando Segovia and Marianne Tolbert taught biblical interpreters decades ago. This place is a space of community, as we necessarily interpret in conversation with others, whether we do so intentionally or unintentionally, knowingly or unknowingly, explicitly or whatever. Thus, the ethical grounding for queer biblical interpretation is being accountable to queers past, present, and future, especially those in proximity to biblical texts and traditions. It's not being accountable to straight interpreters and their concerns, which is something that I am still learning to embrace. So scholars like definitions and complicating definitions, so let's start there. As a lot of folks know, queer is often used as an umbrella term to describe the various non-normative sexual and gender identities signaled by LGBTQIA, etc. But queer also describes an affect, a performative or interpretive set of strategies that are disruptive and challenge the strictures of categorization and regulation, especially those focused on gender and sexuality. As Kent Brittenall points out in his essay on queer studies and religion, these two ways of thinking about queer are in tension. The latter necessarily calling into question the former, that there is some notion of a queer identity or identities. This tension sheds light on the fact that the queer community of accountability mentioned out at the outset is not really a thing. It's an ever-shifting and always unstable mess of gore and glitter. Given this, here's how I'm starting to envision how we display our craft from within this lovely muddle. So Lee Edelman's antisocial thesis receives considerable attention in conversations about all things queer and has relevance for thinking about the ethics of interpretation. Edelman understands queerness in terms of refusal, arguing that queerness is an embodied resistance to, quote, the normalizing protocols that legislate social valorization or social viability, end quote. This oppositional affect, the fuck you of my title, includes resisting the social valorization of reproductive futurism, which makes all things secondary to the child. Reproductive futurism shapes not only how gender and sexuality are idealized and constructed, the health and well-being of the imagined child becomes a way of regulating almost all aspects of society, including, for example, how we allocate money. E.g., we curb spending on finding a vaccine for HIV, but try to ensure that future generations have access to Social Security. And I'm really invested in Social Security since I'm getting up there. But social concern for the child limits queer potential. One of the ethical imperatives raised by Edelman's notion of queerness is the call for analyzing how biblical texts and traditions are deployed in support of reproductive futurism, especially when they're not seemingly about or even invested in the child. For example, queer interpretation explores how biblical texts are censored in Christian contexts because of their anti-child affect. Case in point, why don't we include the so-called slaughter of the innocents in Christmas pageants? This is the Gospel of Matthew's description of King Herod's mass murder of infant and toddler-aged boys in order to thwart the political potential of a future Jewish Messiah. Oh, what fun it would be, I think, if we assigned parts for Slaughtered Babe 1, Slaughtered Babe 2, etc., to those kids in the congregation who get on our last nerve. So another important part of the antisocial thesis that pushes queer interpreters is the recognition that the social is inherently violent. Whenever we seek to create community or a society, there is an other or queer. We might hope for a society inclusive of all, but someone or something always remains on the outside. This idea makes progressives and liberals uncomfortable, makes me uncomfortable, makes my students uncomfortable. We want everyone to be welcome in this place. But what do we do with the homophobe, the TERF, the mansplaining jerk? We make their perspectives off limits and others. Don't get me wrong, I do not think that these folks are oppressed in any way. However, community creation includes setting boundaries for what's in and what's out, and there is some epistemic violence there. I should note that I am not against this kind of violence. I think it's good. So Edelman's antisocial thesis often serves as a foil for the more positive, or dare we say queer as happy, ideas of the late Jose Esteban Munoz. While the juxtaposition of these two makes sense, especially since Munoz references their entanglement in his book, Cruising Utopia, it pits their ideas as an either or and not a both and, although the latter is really more in the spirit of queer interpretive practices. In Cruising Utopia, Munoz describes queerness as a hopeful affect, a way of resisting the here and now with its impressive structures by envisioning and moving forward toward a different way of being and configuring our communities and societies. Surely you can see how that's antithetical to the antisocial. I love that double negative. This is an interpretive strategy that finds openings in text, broadly defined, that can be used as ways into new worlds. And I'm going to just go a little further, but in an essay on Revelation's New Jerusalem imagery, Eric Thomas, another druid, I know Eric is a druid, Eric Thomas offers an excellent example of this reading practice and its ethical potential. Thomas disidentifies an idea taken from Munoz with those left outside of Revelation's New Jerusalem in John the Seer's vision, including the dogs, the sorcerers, and the fornicators, exclusions that are often used against queers. Instead of banging on the door of the New Jerusalem, Thomas finds queer hope in this outside space. Taking on the role of queer seer himself, Thomas recalls the diverse and writhing community created on the dance floor of the Paradise Garage, a popular queer NYC disco, and names that as New Jerusalem. This is our utopia and our way of resisting both biblical oppression and the oppressive context created by biblical texts and traditions. The ability to find in these textual openings, these places where we can turn the text on its head and use it to authorize our own spaces and places. And this is the ethical imperative of queer biblical interpretation. For Munoz and clearly for Thomas, queerness is about collectivity and belonging in difference, language that Munoz uses. Both push queer interpreters to listen to the other who stands with us and near us, and to think of ways to, quote, step out of the straight present. So the talk of utopia can easily be conflated with the assumption that our object or aim is happiness, something that Sarah Ahmed, for one, rejects. The conflation of happiness with the good and the assumption that happiness is the end is decidedly unqueer. As Ahmed notes, quote, when we are estranged from happiness, things happen, end quote. Embracing possibility, the unrestrained potential in the queer, means allowing for unhappiness, disease, and discomfort. However, there's the possibility that gay happiness may happen, but the queer must always have the fuck you at the ready for those who want to censure our attempts at connectivity. So navigating the porous boundary between queer as happy and queer as fuck you seems to be inherent to the activity of queer interpretation and the place where we stake our ethical claim. It's a place of queer poetics. Ways of communicating and creating connection are drawn upon and deployed. Queer forms such as camp, drag, irony, filth, sass, glitter, promiscuity, polyamory, and the eager embrace of commitment among our second date involved a U-Haul lesbians. These are the tools we use in queer biblical interpretation, the tools we use to deconstruct the master's house, to nod to Audre Lorde, to make way for our own filthy, yet fabulous, seedy, yet strangely earnest place of connection, a place of connection that's not suitable for the child. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. So we have a few minutes open for Q&A. And so I just want to take, I know that we have a couple of audience questions, so I want to take those and toss them out to the panel. So the first one is, so the model of interpretation as translation that Dr. Eubanks mentioned has me thinking about anxieties that come up in conversations about what might be added in translation or interpretation and what might be left out. For example, Dr. Dunbar talking about sexual trafficking in Esther 1:2 as a beauty pageant, right? Which leaves out the parallels to sex trafficking, contemporary sex trafficking, and sort of adds a kind of trivializing lens. I'm wondering whether the speakers could talk about how this framing of meaning as suppletive or depleting in translation or interpretation is taken up in the communities that they are experts in.
I, of course, am happy to answer that. I think that's a concern actually in the text I study, which is the book of Revelation. I mean, it like totally says, do not add anything or, remove anything, or all of these plagues are going to happen on you. I try to remember, especially as I'm doing queer interpretation of Revelation, that that's actually just John saying that, right? And we can tell him, fuck you. In some sense, yeah, like this sort of opening up and allowing interpretation is what it's all about, right? And I loved that in M's presentation. Like that blew my mind, that with the sort of the rabbinic approach, this text is about sort of inviting us to get into it and to take it in different places.
Yeah, I think I would add that I think when I was just kind of reflecting on the beauty pageant versus the sex trafficking, I wasn't thinking in the vein of something was added or something was left out. I was kind of thinking in the vein of the role of euphemisms and how they are softer ways of saying things that might cover up the actual the experience that one interprets, right? So if one isn't attentive to the passive verbs or different elements of the text, they might read or understand that, these girls are coming, their parents might be bringing them to this beauty pageant, in order for them to get in line to become a new queen. But I would say the other piece about how I came to interpret this as a story of sex trafficking is because of lived experience and because of being embedded in communities where sex trafficking was prominent, right? So I was at the ITC when I first started looking at this text in this way, and that zip code has the highest occurrences of sex trafficking in the nation, right? So I began to wonder how people in the community understood this text, if they could identify these experiences as sexual abuse or as sex trafficking, if they could read beyond, if their life experiences would help them to identify other things in the text that, people who haven't lived through those things aren't able to identify with. So all that to say that I didn't kind of look at it in the vein of adding to or taking away, but our life experience kind of helps us to see or orients us towards different things in the text, and just we frame and understand things differently based on what's in the text, based on our life experiences and those interpretations that we've inherited. So, but my task is not to convince anyone that this is what's happening in the text. It's just an alternative interpretation for you to engage.
So I would say added to or subtracted from what, right? So like the biggest problem, I don't want to say I have a problem with this question, but it's more just like there are assumptions that are being made in the way in which the question itself is phrased, right? Because like if we think of translation as addition to or subtraction from, then we're always already presuming an original, right? So then we're just fucked, right? We're just back to where we started. So I feel like one of the things that I love about the rabbis is that they just really resist that. They don't like the idea that anything is like, they're like, there is like everything is original and also everything is not original. So like the the whole like distinction between like an original and an interpretation, that difference is just not really there. Like sure, there are certain kinds of interpretations and interpretational techniques that are used to like illuminate what might be in a text or whatever, but the idea that like that there's originality is itself kind of like, it's very fluid. And one of the ways that you can really see this in the Gemara, especially in the Talmud, is through the entire citational style. So there's this whole tradition within the Talmud of so-and-so says in the name of so-and-so. And so there's already this like collapsing of originality, right? Because like if who was the one? It was like if Rabbi Natan says in the name of Talion or whatever, like who's the original there? Like, is it the person who they're saying said it, or is it the person? Like, at what level of redaction are we? Like, is it the Stam that's saying this? Like, is it the editor of the Talmud? Like, this whole idea of original, just like kind of like add or subtract from what? And so like, I would just say that one of the things I find so enlightening about Midrash is just that these questions of adding and subtracting don't make sense. Because like, that's just not how that's not what Torah is. Like Torah literally means teaching. And so there's the idea that teaching itself is originary. As teachers, we all know this. The idea that teaching is originary is really weird. Like to think of it as originary is strange, because we're always, whenever we teach, we're channeling our past teachers as well as ourselves. So there's like, well, there's no original. That to say that there is would to like not really understand like what it is that what teaching is, because teaching's not just translation, right? It's not just simply the movement of one thing to another. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I think in some ways it taps into the question that Shaylee like poked us with, this QAnon question, which in a short version was like, if we want to allow people to make their own meanings within their own communities, then what do we say about dangerous groups that make dangerous meanings? Like, you know, like, hold up, is there a limit? And I think it kind of comes back to what Erica was saying, and Im and Lynn as well, and Lauren and some of her stuff, like this idea of like commitment to reading from this place and commitment to reading with these people. And the idea of like who gets to have knowledge and who gets to have insight and things like that. You know, one of my favorite passages from the sutras is when one of the enlightened beings, because there's a bunch of them, says, you know, I have gotten this insight and I'm willing to preach it to people in the language of people, and to birds in the language of birds, and to demons in the language of demons. You know, and I'm like, yeah, it's all interpretation, right? There's insight to be gleaned. And I think the question is really not what's in and what's left out, but in some ways, I think Erica's question, like, who's left out? You know, who are you going to be responsible to in doing this meaning, and who is just added from the margins, right? And who gets to occupy the center? What happens if we take that story from Esther and we read it from the position of walking into that room as opposed to already being in it. And I think it's like, it opens up all kinds of ways where we can let, you know, we can just let new ideas and new ways of knowing come to the center stage, which is just, I love it.
I would only add one super brief thing. Oh, sorry, Shaylee. Oh, okay. Connecting to, I'm scrolling up in the chat now. What I gotta go way up here. David Collins pointed out at 1:15, okay, 1:15 my time on the West Coast, pointed out with the different like channels versus modes, right? If we start thinking about connecting, I think extending what Charlotte was just saying about thinking about different kinds of ways of, you know, ways in which meaning is experienced, right? Like it's certainly not limited to written words on the page, but also sounds and that kind of thing. And as well, I think like something that my work has really led me to is also back to understanding and then realizing this is more of a personal contention than something I could really prove, but I feel like people probably agree with me here, which is that like if you're sitting silently reading like words off a page of a book, that's not a disembodied experience either, right? It's not like that is like a rational kind of uninhibited disembodied mode of engagement, and others are somehow embodied. Yeah.
I was going to add sort of off of Charlotte's point of, you know, listening to sort of the folks on the margin. I think I mean, there is a sense of, and to Erica's point, and sort of listening to the multiple voices, I think that needs to happen. But I also think there needs to be some shutting up of some voices, right? And that's something that I feel like is kind of sometimes hard to learn. And especially as like sort of a queer interpreter coming to the text and doing sort of queer interpretation and feeling like I have to justify my readings to like, you know, to the QAnon person or to, you know, or to the cisgender white male guy sitting in the back of the room at our annual meeting, that I somehow have to be legible to him. I don't. And sort of kind of recognizing that and sort of being okay with that, to me is something that it's like, I think now with some privilege, I mean, I recognize I have privilege and I'm kind of able to do that in a way that a lot of people aren't able to do. But it's also something I'm learning, I guess.
Anybody else want to add to that? No. So let me just thank our panelists again for taking the time. It's been a rough term. So I appreciate you all just taking the time to talk to us. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This was a lot of fun. So I hope this was fruitful for you. We'll throw it up on the web and we will let you know where to find it. Thanks everyone.